Her hands were shaking. The needle was already in her grip, and the most powerful doctor in that hospital was screaming directly into her face, "Put that down. That is an order." She didn't put it down. 23 years old, 8 months on the job. And in that single moment, Sher Harper made a choice that would either save a man's life or end her career forever. Nobody in that room believed she was right. Not one person. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The ER at St. Jude Memorial Hospital never slept. Not really. It breathed loud and ragged like a living thing that had been running for too long without rest. Monitors beeped. Gurneys rolled, moaned, voices overlapped and cut through each other the way they always did on a Tuesday night when the waiting room chairs were full and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with a particular brand of exhaustion that only people who work in hospitals truly understand. Sher Harper understood it better than most, not because she had years of experience, but because she had something rarer than experience in a place like this. She paid attention. She had been paying attention since 6:47 that morning when she clocked in for what was supposed to be a standard 12-hour shift. By the time 11 p.m. rolled around, she had already charted 16 patients, assisted in 2 trauma responses, and hadn't eaten anything since a granola bar she'd shoved in her mouth between rooms 4 and 5. Her feet ached. Her back ached worse. But her mind was sharp in the way that only happens when you care too much to let yourself stop thinking. She was standing at the nurse's station updating a chart when the radio crackled. "Incoming, male 61, severe chest pain, acute respiratory distress, ETA 2 minutes. Her charge nurse, Donna Reyes, was already moving. "Harper, Bay 3, let's go." Cher clipped her pen to her pocket and followed. The paramedics came through the ambulance bay doors the way they always did, fast, loud, and with purpose. But something was different this time. The energy surrounding this particular gurney was different. Not medically, not yet. But the 2 men flanking the stretcher were wearing the specific kind of tension that only comes when the person on the gurney is someone important. Sawyer Pendleton, the lead paramedic, called out, transferring care at a rapid clip. 61-year-old male, no prior cardiac history wife, reports sudden onset chest pain at approximately 10:15 p.m. Rapid decline in oxygen saturation, 89% on a scene, currently 91 on 10 liters. Respiratory rate at 32, diaphoretic, distressed. Cher already had her eyes on him. Sawyer Pendleton was a big man, broad-shouldered, even flat on his back. His silver hair was damp with sweat, and his face had the particular gray-white pallor that made experienced nurses unconsciously hold their breath. But it was his breathing that caught Cher's attention immediately, the way his chest rose unevenly, the left side lagging just slightly behind the right, the way his left hand kept drifting upward toward his own throat without him seeming to realize it. She noted it. She filed it. She said nothing yet because the room was already changing around her. Dr. Richard Sterling had arrived. You could always feel it when Dr. Sterling walked into an ER bay. It wasn't arrogance exactly, or at least that's what people told themselves. It was authority. The man had 31 years behind him. He had published papers. He had trained residents who now ran departments in hospitals across the country. His word in that ER was, for all practical purposes, law. He was 64 years old. He was tall. He wore his white coat like armor. And tonight his eyes swept across Sawyer Pendleton the way a chess grandmaster surveys a board fast, certain already 5 moves ahead. "Pulmonary embolism," he said. Not a question, a declaration. Donna Reyes nodded beside him, pulling up the vitals on the monitor. Consistent with the presentation, "Get me a CTP, him, A order, and start heparin." Sterling's voice was calm, practiced, completely unmoved. "And get TPA ready. If the CT confirms what I already know, we're not wasting time." Cher's pen stopped moving on her clipboard. TPA. Tissue plasminogen activator. A clot-busting drug powerful enough to dissolve a pulmonary embolism and powerful enough, if given to the wrong patient with the wrong condition, to cause catastrophic internal bleeding. She looked at Sawyer Pendleton's chest again. Left side, lagging. That's the thing nobody tells you about being a rookie. It isn't the medical knowledge that's hard. You study, you pass your boards, you drill the protocols until they're a muscle memory. What's hard is the moment when your gut says something is wrong, and every single person in the room with more experience than you is moving confidently in the opposite direction. You start to doubt your own eyes. Cher had been doubting herself for about 45 seconds when Sawyer Pendleton grabbed her wrist. She hadn't even realized she'd stepped close enough for him to reach her. But his hand was there, big, warm, trembling, wrapped around her wrist, with the desperate grip of a man who knew on some animal level that he was running out of time. His eyes found hers. They were blue watery with pain, but sharp. Completely sharp. Something's, he wheezed, coughed. His jaw tightened against what was clearly an overwhelming pressure in his chest. Something's wrong with I know, Shear said quietly. She said it before she even knew she was going to say it. Dr. Sterling looked up from the chart. One eyebrow lifted, barely, the expression of a man who has just noticed an insect near his coffee cup. Nurse Harper. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. I'll need you focused, please. Yes, sir. She released Sawyer's hand gently. She stepped back. She looked at the monitor. Oxygen saturation 90%, dropping. Respiratory rate 34, rising. Left chest wall, still lagging. Pulmonary embolism. That was Sterling's call. Classic presentation in many ways. Sudden onset respiratory distress, tachycardia, hypoxia. A 61-year-old man, likely sedentary, a dinner wife, says he stood up from the table and just went down. But PE didn't typically cause asymmetric chest movement. PE didn't cause the trachea to deviate, and Cher's eyes kept tracking back to Sawyer's neck, to the almost imperceptible shift of his windpipe just slightly toward the right. PE didn't cause the left side of the chest to sit higher than the right, subtly the way a tire looks before it fully blows. Tension pneumothorax. The words formed in her mind with the quiet certainty of a match being struck in a dark room. Air, trapped in the pleural space. Building pressure with every single breath. Compressing the lung, shifting the mediastinum, about to crush the great vessels and stop the heart entirely. And if you gave TPA to a man with a tension pneumothorax, Cher's stomach dropped 3 floors. You would kill him. Dr. Sterling. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I have a concern about the diagnosis. The room changed, not dramatically, not the way it does in movies, more like the way a room changes when someone says something at a dinner party that nobody expected. A subtle shift. Heads that had been down came up. Donna Reyes's chin lifted a fraction. The resident near the medication cart, Dr. Priya Anand, second year, who Cher had always found quietly kind, looked up with an expression that was equal parts surprise and something that might have been cautious interest. Dr. Sterling turned slowly. I'm sorry, he said. I think we should rule out tension pneumothorax before we move forward with TPA. Cher kept her eyes on him. She would not look away. She would not. His left chest wall movement is asymmetric. His trachea looks like it might be deviating to the right. And his presentation is classic PE Nurse Harper. Sterling's voice was patient, the way a teacher's voice is patient when a student has given an answer so wrong it barely warrants correction. Sudden onset, hypoxia, tachycardia, no history of trauma. Tension pneumothorax can present spontaneously I'm aware of what it can do. His voice dropped 1 degree. Are you aware that CTPA is already ordered, that we are following established protocol, that you are, he paused precisely. A nurse. The word landed the way he intended it to. Cher felt the heat rise in her face. She felt the eyes of every person in that bay move to her. She felt with terrible clarity the weight of 8 months of experience against 31 years. And she looked at Sawyer Pendleton, whose oxygen saturation now read 87%, whose neck veins had begun to distend, whose left chest wall was barely moving at all. Donna, she said, and her voice was completely quiet. Can you come look at something with me for 1 second? Donna Reyes was a 20-year ER veteran. She was no-nonsense, occasionally sharp-tongued, and deeply fair. She had a habit of chewing the cap of her pen when she was thinking hard about something, and right now, as Cher guided her gently to Sawyer's left side and pointed without a word to his chest wall, to his neck. To the monitor, Donna Reyes put her pen cap in her mouth and chewed. She was quiet for 4 seconds. Those 4 seconds felt like a geological era. Dr. Sterling, Donna said. We're preparing for CET, he replied, not looking up. I think we should hold 1 moment. Now he looked up. Reyes. His voice had taken on a new edge. His JVD is worsening, Donna said flatly, using the clinical shorthand for jugular venous distension, the swelling of the neck veins that Cher had been watching climb for the past 2 minutes. His trachea is deviated right. Left breath sounds. She grabbed a stethoscope from the wall and pressed it to Sawyer's chest with practiced speed, listened, moved it, listened again. Her face went still. Left breath sounds are absent. The room went very quiet. That's impossible, Dr. Sterling said. Cher would remember those words for the rest of her career, not because they were cruel. Sterling hadn't meant them to be, she would later come to understand that. He had meant them the way anyone means them, when they are completely certain they are right and the evidence is trying to tell them otherwise. That's impossible means I have already decided and I will not be moved. And in that moment, Sawyer Pendleton's heart monitor screamed. The alarm was sudden and violent in the silence, the rapid, ugly tone of a deteriorating rhythm. His blood pressure, which had been holding at 98/60, plummeted on the screen. His eyes, which had been half open, rolled. He's crashing, Priya Anand's voice. Push the heparin. Sterling was already moving. No. Cher stepped directly between Dr. Sterling and the IV line, physically, her body between his hand and the medication. The entire room froze. Sterling looked at her the way you look at something that has just done something that you cannot quite comprehend. Something beyond insubordination. Something almost outside the categories he had available for situations like this. Nurse Harper. Each word was a stone. Move. Now. If you push heparin into a tension pneumothorax, you will kill him. Cher's voice didn't shake. She was shaking inside. She could feel it, this terrible vibration in her chest, but her voice did not shake. He needs needle decompression. Right now. His left lung is collapsed. The pressure is shifting his heart. You push blood thinner into this man, and there is no coming back. You are completely out of line. Then call a code, Cher said. Call a code, get another attending in here, get anyone, but do not push that medication until someone else listens. Sterling's jaw was tight. His eyes were hard. And for one terrible suspended moment, Cher thought he was going to physically move her out of the way. Then Sawyer Pendleton stopped breathing. Not entirely, not arrest, not yet, but his respiratory effort collapsed into something shallow and desperate and wrong, and the monitor wailed and someone in the bay said, BP's dropping 60 over palp. And Dr. Sterling looked at the monitor, and for the first time in 31 years, Richard Sterling hesitated. 3 seconds was long enough. Cher moved to the supply cart. Her hands found the large bore needle and 14-gauge angiocath, the equipment for emergency needle decompression, before she had consciously decided to pick it up. 8 months of training, 8 months of simulations of mannequins of instructors saying second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line go in at 90 degrees, all of it compressed into the act of turning toward Sawyer Pendleton's left side. Harper, Sterling's voice. She swabbed the site. Harper, I will have your license. She positioned in the needle. Donna Reyes said very quietly to nobody in particular, God help us. Cher drove the needle in. A hiss, sharp and clear and sudden, like a pressure valve releasing, which is exactly what it was. Air. Trapped, compressed, life-ending air might rushing out through that small catheter in a steady, audible stream. And Sawyer Pendleton gasped. Not a little gasp. A gasp, his whole chest expanding for the first time in what must have felt like forever. His body seizing the oxygen, it had been denied, his color changing from that terrible gray-white to something approaching human within seconds. His eyes flew open. His hands gripped the sides of the gurney. The monitor changed. The alarm stopped. The rhythm returned, rapid, stressed, but organized. 90/60, then 95, then 100. Oxygen saturation climbing. 90, 93, 95. Nobody spoke. The hiss from the needle continued steady and definitive. Priya Anand had both hands pressed over her mouth. Donna Reyes stood perfectly still, stethoscope still in her hand. And Dr. Richard Sterling, 31 years published papers, the man whose word in this ER was law, stood at the foot of Sawyer Pendleton's bed and watched a 23-year-old rookie nurse save a life that he had been about to end. His face was unreadable. The room smelled like adrenaline and antiseptic, and something else, something that didn't have a clinical name. The particular atmosphere of a moment that everyone present knows on some wordless level they will remember for the rest of their lives. Sawyer Pendleton's eyes found Cher's face. He was still breathing hard, still shaking, but his eyes were sharp again, blue and present, and overwhelmingly, terrifyingly alive. Thank you, he whispered. Cher nodded once. Her hands were shaking now that it was done, now that the action had passed and left nothing behind but the aftermath. She nodded and she did not trust herself to speak. She pressed a clean piece of gauze over the catheter site. She looked at his chart and she waited for what she already knew was coming. Dr. Sterling turned and walked out of the bay without speaking to her. That was the moment. Donna Reyes looked at Cher across Sawyer Pendleton's body, and her expression said everything that protocol would not allow her to say out loud. You did the right thing, and it is going to cost you everything. Cher Harper was 23 years old. She had been a nurse for 8 months. She had just performed an emergency procedure against the explicit orders of the chief of emergency medicine. She had physically blocked a senior physician from administering medication. She had, by every technical definition of the hospital's conduct code, committed insubordination. And the man on the gurney, whose name she now knew was Sawyer Pendleton, whose wife was reportedly in the waiting room, whose foundation had donated $4 million to this hospital in the last decade, was breathing steadily, his color coming back, his monitor singing the clean, even song of a heart that had been given back its room to beat. Shira pressed 2 fingers lightly to his wrist. Strong pulse. She exhaled slowly. And somewhere down the hallway, she could already hear Dr. Sterling's voice, low, controlled, deliberate, speaking into a phone. She didn't need to hear the words. She had saved Sawyer Pendleton's life. And before this night was over, that might be the last thing she ever did at St. Jude Memorial Hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed on overhead, indifferent and bright the way they always had. The ER breathed around her, loud and ragged and alive. Gurneys rolled, monitors beeped, voices overlapped. And Sher Harper stood at the bedside of the man she had just saved, her hands finally still, and she prepared herself for the storm. The storm didn't wait until morning. It came within the hour, quiet and precise, the way the most dangerous things always do. Not with shouting, not with sirens. With a knock on the supply room door, and 4 words from the nursing supervisor, Janet Briggs, whose voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering a verdict they had already made peace with. "They need you upstairs." Sher looked up from the medication count she had forced herself to finish because standing still felt like surrender. Upstairs meant administration. At 11:47 at night, upstairs meant someone had made phone calls. Important ones, fast ones. "Give me 2 minutes," Shear said. "They said now." She set down the clipboard. She looked once at Donna Reyes, who was standing at the far end of the medication cart with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. Donna gave her one small nod, the kind that says, "I see you and I'm sorry, and don't you dare apologize for what you did all at once." Cher walked out of the supply room and followed Janet Briggs toward the elevator. She didn't look back. The elevator doors closed and the silence inside was the loudest thing Cher had heard all night. Janet Briggs stared at the floor numbers. "For what it's worth," she said, and then she stopped. "Say it," Cher said. Janet exhaled through her nose. "For what it's worth, I've been a nurse for 22 years, and I've never seen anyone do what you did tonight." She paused. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment yet." "That makes 2 of us," Cher said. The elevator opened on the 4th floor. The administrative wing of St. Jude Memorial at midnight had a specific quality to it. The carpet-absorbed sound, the overhead lights were softer. The whole atmosphere was engineered to make people feel calm just before something important and irreversible was said to them. Cher had been up here exactly once before during orientation when everything was still theoretical, and her badge was so new the plastic smelled like a factory. She had been so proud of that badge. Now she walked past the conference room window and saw them through the glass. 3 people already seated, and her stomach sank before she could stop it. Dr. Richard Sterling, arms folded, eyes forward. Dr. Carol Marsh, Chief Medical Officer. Gray blazer, reading glasses on, papers already in her hand. And a man in a suit that Cher didn't recognize with a phone face down on the table in front of him who had the specific, quiet energy of someone whose job it was to manage consequences. Janet Briggs stopped at the door. "Good luck," she said. She meant it. That almost made it worse. Cher pushed the door open and walked in. Nobody stood. Nobody offered her a chair. She took one anyway. Dr. Marsh looked up from her papers. She had a face built for composure, the kind of face that had delivered difficult conversations so many times it had simply absorbed the weight of them. "Nurse Harper," she said, "I think you know why you're here." "I do," Cher said. "Then I'll be direct." Marsh set the papers flat on the table. "At approximately 11:14 p.m. tonight, you physically obstructed Dr. Sterling from administering a prescribed medication. You then performed a needle decompression without a physician's order, without proper authorization, and in direct contravention of Dr. Sterling's explicit verbal directive." She paused. "Is that an accurate summary?" "Medically accurate," Cher said. "Contextually incomplete." The man in the suit looked up. Sterling made a sound in his throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Something precise and contemptuous. "Contextually incomplete. She performed unauthorized surgery on a patient, and she's playing semantics." "Needle decompression is not surgery," Cher said. "You are a nurse," Sterling said. Each syllable its own sentence. 8 months out of school. You countermanded a direct order from the chief of emergency medicine in front of his entire department. You endangered a patient with an unverified diagnosis, and then you had the... He stopped, composed himself. "The audacity to stand there and tell me I was wrong." "You were wrong," Cher said. The room held its breath. Dr. Marsh took off her glasses. Nurse Harper. His left lung was collapsed, Shear said. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. She had run this through her head in the elevator. She had decided she was going to say it cleanly and completely and without apology, and she was going to do that now. His trachea was deviated to the right. His neck veins were distending. His left breath sounds were absent. Those are 4 clinical signs of tension pneumothorax. Classic. Textbook. If you had administered TPA to a patient with a tension pneumothorax, the resulting hemorrhage into the pleural space would have been unsurvivable. He would have died on that table. Sterling's eyes were very dark and very still. And you arrived at this diagnosis in what, 4 minutes at the bedside? Donna Reyes confirmed the absent breath sounds before I moved. Donna Reyes is not the treating physician. No, but she's a 20-year ER veteran who put a stethoscope on his chest and heard nothing on the left side, and I watched her face when she heard it. Sure looked directly at Sterling. You didn't look at her face. You were already reaching for the IV line. The silence that followed was the kind that means something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Dr. Marsh set her glasses back on. She looked at the man in the suit. Something passed between them, wordless, instantaneous, the language of administrators who have learned to communicate without speaking in rooms full of witnesses. The patient's status, Marsh said carefully, Sawyer Pendleton. Current condition. The man in the suit checked his phone. She noticed he'd turned it face up at some point during Scher's last statement. Stable, they've placed a chest tube. Cardiothoracic surgery consulted. He's en route to the ICU. He paused. His wife is requesting to speak with the treating team. I am no longer the treating physician, Sterling said flatly. No. Marsh agreed in a tone that suggested she was going to need to think carefully about what that sentence meant and what it might eventually cost them. You're not. Another silence. Then, Nurse Harper, Marsh said, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending a full review of tonight's events. Your access badge will be suspended. You're not to return to the floor until the review committee has completed its assessment. Do you understand? Oh, Sure understood. She'd understood it was coming since the moment the hiss of air came out of that needle and Sterling's face went the color of old marble. I understand, she said. You may go. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. Nurse Harper. She turned. It was Sterling. He had turned in his chair, not quite facing her, his jaw working for a moment around something he was deciding whether to say. You got lucky, he said. That's all this was. You got lucky, and a patient nearly died because of your recklessness, and when the review committee sees the full picture, that will be clear. Scher stood very still. Mr. Pendleton's oxygen saturation is 97%, she said. When I walked in here, it was 87 and falling. I hope the review committee finds that interesting. She walked out. She made it to the elevator. She made it inside. She pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed. And then in the privacy of that small steel box moving quietly down through the body of the building, Scher Harper pressed her back against the wall, tilted her head up toward the ceiling, and let out one single shaking breath that carried every ounce of adrenaline and terror and grief that she had been holding in her chest since the moment she picked up that needle. She did not cry. She had decided she was not going to cry until she was home, and she was going to keep that promise to herself. But it was close. The doors opened on the ground floor, and she walked out into the lobby and then through the front exit and into the parking lot where the air was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, and she stood next to her car for a moment and just breathed. Her phone buzzed. Donna Reyes, text message. 3 words, I saw everything. Then another message immediately after. You did right. Don't let them tell you different. Cher stared at her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She wanted to respond. She wanted to say something that was equal to what Donna had just given her, this small, sturdy anchor dropped into the middle of a night that was trying to sweep her out to sea. She typed, thank you. It wasn't enough. But it was what she had. She got in her car. She drove home. She sat in her parking spot for 11 minutes before she could make herself go inside. She didn't sleep. By 6 in the morning, she had replayed every second of Bay 3 47 times. She had second-guessed the tracheal deviation had it been real, or had she projected it? Oh, Donna had seen it too. She had questioned her reading of the breath sounds, but Donna had confirmed them with a stethoscope. She had turned over Sterling's diagnosis from every angle, looking for the crack in her own certainty, and every single time she came back to the same place. She had been right. Being right had cost her everything she had spent 3 years of nursing school and 8 months of her life building. At 7:23 a.m. her phone rang, unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up the same instinct maybe that had made her pick up the needle. Is this Cher Harper? The voice was a woman's, measured, unhurried. The voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. Yes, Cher said. My name is Margaret Pendleton. I believe you saved my husband's life last night. Cher sat up straight. Mrs. Pendleton, please don't be gracious yet. I'm not calling to thank you. I mean, I am, but that's not the primary reason. A pause, the sound of someone choosing words with care. I understand you have been placed on administrative leave. I'm not really at liberty to discuss the hospitals. My husband was awake for 3 hours last night, Margaret Pendleton said, after the chest tube. He was in pain and he was frightened, and apparently he also needed to tell every single nurse and doctor who walked into his ICU room exactly what he remembered about what happened in that emergency bay. Another pause. He remembers a great deal, Ms. Harper. Sawyer has always been inconveniently observant. It's one of the reasons his foundation has been so effective. Her voice softened. He told me about the needle. He told me about the doctor who tried to stop you. He told me what you said. Cher didn't speak. He asked me to call the hospital's board of directors this morning, Margaret continued. He asked me to do it before 7 a.m. She paused. I did. I want you to know that. Mrs. Pendleton, Cher's voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't expected. She pressed her fist against her sternum. I was just doing my job. No, Margaret Pendleton said quietly and with absolute certainty. You were doing the right thing. Those are not always the same. I've been married to a man in public life for 33 years. I know the difference better than most. After the call ended, Cher sat with her phone in her lap and stared at the wall of her apartment for a long time. She thought about the way Sawyer Pendleton had grabbed her wrist in that bay, that desperate, wordless grip of a man who knew he was slipping and was reaching for whoever was closest. She thought about his blue eyes sharp through the pain. She thought about the hiss of air from the needle and the way his color had come back visible and sudden like a light turning on in a dark room. She thought about Sterling's face. That's impossible. She thought about what it means when the most powerful person in the room says that's impossible, and everyone around them adjusts their vision to match, because it is easier and safer to see what the powerful person sees than to trust what your own eyes are telling you. She had not adjusted her vision, and now she was sitting in her apartment at 7:40 in the morning, with a suspended badge and a review committee convening about her future, and somewhere on the 4th floor of St. Jude Memorial Hospital, Richard Sterling was still a physician, and she was not. Her phone rang again. This time it was a number she recognized. James Whitfield, the nurses' union representative she had spoken to exactly once during orientation, when she had signed approximately 40 forms, and been told in a general way that she had support if she needed it. She was going to need it. Cher Harper. His voice was awake and alert in a way that said he'd been up for a while and was already moving on her behalf. I've been briefed on last night. I need you to listen to me carefully. I'm listening, she said. Don't talk to hospital administration again without me in the room. Don't sign anything. Don't issue any written statement, apology, or clarification of any kind. He spoke quickly and without drama, the voice of someone who had navigated these waters before. The situation is changing faster than the hospital expected. I'm getting calls. You need to sit tight and not give them anything to work with. What kind of calls? Cher asked. A pause. The kind, Whitfield said carefully, that come after a patient's family makes contact with a board of directors at 6:53 in the morning. Cher exhaled. The review committee is still convening, Whitfield continued. They have to. Process has to play out. But the ground is shifting, Cher. You need to trust me and you need to stay quiet. After she hung up, she went to her kitchen. She made coffee she didn't drink. She stood at the counter and thought about Donna Rhea's text message. You did right, and about Margaret Pendleton's measured certain voice, and about the way James Whitfield had said the ground is shifting with the careful optimism of someone who has seen cases turn and has learned not to promise things he can't deliver. She thought about Dr. Sterling. She thought about him in a way she hadn't let herself do yet. Not as an obstacle, not as an adversary, but as a person, 64 years old, 31 years, a career built on certainty, on being the one in the room who knew who had seen it before, who other people organized themselves around. And last night in Bay 3, a 23-year-old, 8 months out of school, had stood in front of him and said quietly and without apology, "You are wrong." She wondered what that did to a person. She wondered if it mattered, given that the alternative was a dead man on a gurney. She decided it mattered and didn't matter simultaneously the way most complicated human things do. At 9:15 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. The message was 8 words. She called the board. They're already meeting. Hold on. She stared at the message. No name, no context, but the voice in her head that had learned over the last 14 hours to trust its own instincts, said Priya Anand, the second-year resident who had stood in Bay 3 with both hands pressed over her mouth, who had seen everything, who had said nothing last night because she couldn't, because her position was even more precarious than Sher's, because residents existed in a particular kind of institutional vulnerability that made speaking up feel like standing on a glass floor. But she had sent that text. Sher saved the number. She typed back, "Thank you. I'm holding on." The response came in under a minute. A single word. Good. And somewhere in the hospital in the ICU, where Sawyer Pendleton was breathing steadily on 97% oxygen in the boardroom, where Margaret Pendleton's calls were landing with the particular weight of a family whose name was on two wings of the building, in the administrative offices where Dr. Carol Marsh was sitting with a file that was rapidly becoming something she hadn't expected, the ground was shifting. Sher Harper didn't know yet which way it would break. She picked up her cold coffee. She sat down at her kitchen table. She waited the way you wait when you have done everything you can do and the next move belongs to a world larger than yourself. Outside, the rain finally came. The review committee met at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in conference room B on the fourth floor, which was the same room where Cher had sat the night before with her badge still clipped to her chest and her hands folded on the table and her career still technically intact. 14 hours had passed since then. 14 hours that had moved the way time moves during a crisis, some minutes impossibly slow, some so fast she couldn't account for them afterward. James Whitfield met her in the lobby at 1:45. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of calm that comes not from indifference, but from having sat in enough difficult rooms to stop being afraid of them. He shook her hand. He looked at her face. He said, "How are you holding up?" the way a person asks when they actually want to know. "I'm functioning," Cher said. "Good enough," he said. "That's all you need to do in there. Function. Answer what they ask. Don't volunteer. Don't apologize." He glanced at her as they walked toward the elevator. "And don't let Sterling rattle you. He's going to try." "I know," she said. "He's good at it," Whitfield said. "I want you ready for that." "I've been ready since 11 p.m. last night." He looked at her again, nodded once the way you nod when someone has just confirmed something you were hoping was true about them. They rode the elevator in silence. The conference room was fuller than she expected. Dr. Carol Marsh sat at the head of the table. To her left was Dr. George Tanaka, Chief of Staff, a quiet man in his late 60s who Cher had seen exactly twice in the hallways of St. Jude and who had the reputation of being deeply fair and deeply slow to decide which were usually the same quality wearing different hats. Beside him sat two members of the hospital's legal team. She could tell by the way they held their pens and the way they were not quite looking at anyone directly. On Marsh's right sat Dr. Sterling, and beside him was a woman Cher didn't recognize who was almost certainly his own representation. And at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the others, sat Dr. Priya Anand. Cher hadn't expected that. She felt something shift in her chest, relief complicated by the immediate understanding of what it meant that Priya was here. Priya had been called as a witness, which meant someone had decided her account of what happened in Bay 3 was worth hearing under formal conditions, which meant someone had decided this was not going to be the quiet administrative burial that Sterling had probably assumed it would be when he picked up his phone at 11:30 the previous night. Priya caught Cher's eye for exactly 1 second. Her expression gave nothing away, but she was there. She was there, and she was sitting at that table, and that was enough. Cher sat down beside Whitfield. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. Dr. Marsh opened the session without preamble. "This is a formal clinical review of events occurring in Emergency Bay 3 at St. Jude Memorial Hospital at approximately 11:14 p.m. on Tuesday evening. The primary question before this committee is whether the actions of Nurse Cher Harper constitute a violation of clinical protocol and hospital conduct policy, and if so, to what degree. All parties have been informed of the scope and process." She looked around the table. "Dr. Sterling, please summarize your account of the events." Sterling did not hesitate. That was the first thing Cher noticed. No hesitation, no throat clearing, no gathering of thoughts. He had prepared this. He had rehearsed it. 31 years of authority had given him the particular skill of speaking in a way that sounds like fact, even when it is interpretation, and he deployed that skill now with the smooth precision of someone who had never once in his professional life expected to be sitting on this side of the table. He described a patient presenting with classic symptoms of pulmonary embolism. He described a diagnosis reached through established clinical reasoning. He described a nurse he called her Nurse Harper each time with a consistent, deliberate formality that managed to simultaneously respect the title and diminish the person who had expressed a concern been heard, and then acted with reckless unilateral aggression in a manner that endangered the patient, violated protocol, and undermined the institutional hierarchy that exists, he said, for the safety of everyone in that room, including the patients. He never raised his voice. He never used a dramatic word. He was precise and he was damning. And when he finished, he set his hands flat on the table and looked at Marsh and said, "I have nothing further to add, like a man who has said the only true and necessary things and is content to let them stand." Marsh looked at Scher. "Nurse Harper." Scher took a breath. His left breath sounds were absent. She said, "I want to start there because that's where the clinical picture starts. Not with my instinct, not with a hunch. With the absence of sound in a lung that should have been making sound." She kept her voice level. Donna Reyes confirmed it with a stethoscope. Dr. Anand was present and observed the patient's presentation. His trachea was deviated to the right. His jugular veins were distended. His oxygen saturation was 87% and dropping at a rate that was not consistent with a pulmonary embolism receiving supportive oxygen. She paused. "Those are not interpretations. Those are observations that were physically confirmed by a 20-year veteran nurse and witnessed by a second-year resident. I did not act on instinct. I acted on clinical evidence that was present and available to anyone in that room who was looking at the patient." "You acted without a physician's order," one of the legal team said. "I acted within the emergency exception protocol," Whitfield said smoothly and immediately, "which allows a licensed nurse to perform emergency interventions when a patient faces imminent death and the treating physician has been made aware of the clinical concern and failed to act." He slid a document across the table. "Page 37 of St. Jude Memorial's Nursing Practice Guidelines. The language is quite clear." The legal team member picked up the document. His expression didn't change, but his pen stopped moving. Sterling's jaw tightened, just slightly. Scher saw it. "The treating physician," Sterling said, "had not failed to act. The treating physician was in the process of acting on an established diagnosis. The treating physician was about to administer TPA to a patient with a tension pneumothorax," Scher said. "That diagnosis was not confirmed. It was confirmed 40 seconds after the needle decompression by the sound of escaping air from the patient's pleural space," Scher said. "It was confirmed by the immediate restoration of his respiratory effort and blood pressure. It was confirmed by the chest tube placement in the subsequent CT that showed complete left lung collapse with mediastinal shift." She looked directly at Sterling. "The diagnosis was confirmed by the patient being alive." Silence. Dr. Tanaka, who had not spoken since the session opened, set down his pen. He looked at Scher over the rim of his glasses with the unhurried attention of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to pay close attention. "Dr. Anand," he said, "you were present in Bay 3 throughout the incident." "Yes, sir," Priya said. "Tell me what you saw." Priya Anand was 28 years old and in the second year of her emergency medicine residency, and she sat in that conference room with the very specific stillness of someone who has made a decision that frightens them and has decided to make it anyway. She was young enough that her career existed almost entirely in the future, which meant she had more to lose from speaking than anyone at that table except possibly Scher herself. She spoke clearly and completely. She described the patient's presentation. She described Sterling's diagnosis. She described watching Scher's face during the initial assessment. She was tracking the left chest wall. I could see her doing it. I was watching her because I was also uncertain about the diagnosis, but I didn't. She stopped. "I didn't say anything. I wasn't." She looked at Cher briefly. "I wasn't as certain as she was. Or maybe I was as certain, but I wasn't as brave." The room absorbed that sentence. She told Dr. Sterling directly, Priya continued. He dismissed her. She brought Donna Reyes in. Donna confirmed the absent breath sounds. She told Dr. Sterling again. He dismissed her again. Priya's voice was steady in the way that means someone is using steadiness as a container for something that would otherwise spill. And then Mr. Pendleton crashed, and Nurse Harper performed the needle decompression, and the sound of the air escaping from the pleural space was... She stopped again. I've never heard anything like it. And his color came back in seconds. His blood pressure came back. His rhythm stabilized. She folded her hands on the table. I have no clinical uncertainty about what happened in that room. The diagnosis was tension pneumothorax. The intervention was correct. The outcome was the restoration of the patient's vital signs. She paused. I should have spoken sooner. I want that on record. Dr. Tanaka looked at her for a long moment. It is on record, Bhattacharya, he said. Something in his voice that might have been in a less formal setting, something close to respect. Sterling leaned toward his representative and said something in a low voice. The representative nodded once and wrote something on her notepad. Marsh looked at the legal team. The legal team looked at their documents. There was a conversation happening between all of them that did not use words, and Sher watched it happen and tried to read it and found she couldn't. There were too many variables, too many institutional considerations that she didn't have access to from where she was sitting. Then the conference room door opened. Everyone turned. A young man Sher didn't recognize, administrative assistant from the look of him, early 20s, visibly uncomfortable at having interrupted, leaned in and said quietly but not quietly enough. Dr. Marsh, I'm very sorry. Mrs. Pendleton is here. She's asking to address the committee. She says it won't take long. Marsh looked at Tanaka. Tanaka looked at his hands. Sterling made a sound short controlled, the kind of sound that is carefully not a reaction. Send her in, Tanaka said. Margaret Pendleton was 60 years old and she walked into that conference room the way water finds the lowest point in the landscape, not with force, not with drama, but with the absolute inevitability of something that has already decided where it is going. She was dressed simply. She carried nothing except her composure, and she deployed it the way people deploy the things they have earned without waste. She stood at the end of the table that was not occupied. She looked at the committee. She looked at Cher. She looked last at Dr. Sterling, and her gaze, when it reached him, was not angry. It was something quieter and more difficult than anger. My husband asked me to come, she said. He wanted to come himself. His physicians suggested that was inadvisable. She paused. He said to tell you that he was conscious for longer than anyone realized last night. The pain was significant, but his mind was clear. He heard everything that was said in Bay 3. He heard Nurse Harper tell Dr. Sterling that the diagnosis was wrong. He heard Dr. Sterling dismiss her. He heard it happen twice. She paused again. Her hands were clasped in front of her still. He said that in 33 years of marriage, I have never heard him use the word terrified about himself. He used it last night. He said he was lying on that table and he could feel something failing inside him, and the person who had the authority to save him had decided something about his condition, and he knew it was wrong. Her voice didn't waver, but it thinned at the edges just slightly, the way voices do when the emotion behind them is real enough to press against the structure containing it. He said the only thing standing between him and that certainty was a young woman who would not back down. She looked at Cher directly. You saved his life, she said. With the protocol, not the hierarchy, you personally, because you looked at him and you believed what you saw. She turned back to the committee. My husband's foundation has supported this hospital for 11 years. That support has always been and will continue to be contingent on this institution being a place that does what medicine is actually supposed to do. She picked up the single thing she had brought, which turned out to be a folded letter that she had been holding in her closed hand the entire time, and she placed it on the table in front of Dr. Marsh. That is a letter from Sawyer. He wanted you to have it before you made any final decisions. She looked at the committee one more time. Her gaze moved briefly to Sterling and then moved away the way you look at something that was once significant and has become in the space of a night a settled question. Thank you for your time. She walked out. The room was very still. Marsh unfolded the letter. She read it. She passed it to Tanaka without comment. Tanaka read it. He passed it down the table. Cher never saw its contents directly. She would piece them together later from things that were said in the days that followed. But she watched the faces of the people who read it, and what she saw was not surprise. What she saw was inevitability, arriving ahead of schedule. Sterling's representative put her pen down. Whitfield beside Cher said nothing, but she felt him exhale slowly. The careful exhale of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and is beginning to feel the ground solidify underfoot. I'd like to request a 30-minute recess, Sterling said. Denied, Dr. Tanaka said. The word was quiet and final, and it fell into the room like a stone into still water. Sterling looked at him. Something moved across his face, a complex, rapid sequence of things that Cher couldn't fully name, but recognized as the particular distress of a man watching a story he has told himself about himself begin to come apart at the seams. Dr. Sterling, Tanaka said in the same unhurried voice he'd used throughout, I've read your file. I've known you for 19 years. I know what you've built in that department, and I know the standard of care you've maintained. He paused. I also know what I've heard in the last 40 minutes, and I know what that letter says. He removed his glasses, cleaned them, Put them back on. It was a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture, and Cher understood it was deliberate. This was a man who used his silences and his habits to tell you what he needed you to understand before he said it in words. The question before this committee is not whether Nurse Harper violated protocol. She violated the letter of it. That's not in dispute. He looked at Cher. The question is whether protocol in this instance was the correct guide. And I think we all know the answer to that. Sterling closed his eyes just for a moment, just briefly enough that you might almost miss it. But Cher didn't miss it. She saw his face in that moment, not the chief of emergency medicine, not the 31-year veteran, not the authority and the certainty in the 31 years of knowing. Just a man who had been wrong about something that mattered enormously and who was sitting in a room full of people who knew it and who had to decide right now in this moment what kind of person he was going to be on the other side of being wrong. She had not expected to feel anything for him. She felt something. The committee will recess for 15 minutes, Marsh said, and when we return, we will conclude this hearing. She looked around the table. Her gaze settled on Cher last. Nurse Harper, please remain available. Cher nodded. She stood. She walked out into the hallway. She leaned against the wall and breathed and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man with blue eyes grabbing her wrist in the dark of an emergency bay and about the sound of a needle finding its mark and about rain coming down outside her apartment window while she sat at her kitchen table and waited to find out what her life was going to look like. Whitfield came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Tanaka's a fair man, he said. I know, Cher said. This isn't over, he said, but it's turning. I know, she said again. She looked down at her hands. Steady now, completely steady. She thought about Priya Anand saying I should have spoken sooner, saying it cleanly and without excuse in front of everyone in a room where it could have cost her everything. She thought about Donna Reyes's text message. She thought about Margaret Pendleton walking into that room carrying nothing but the truth. She thought about what it means to be right in a world that has organized itself very carefully around the comfort of the powerful. She thought about what it costs. She thought about what it would have cost not to Trima. The door to conference room B opened. Nurse Harper, the administrative assistant said, they're ready for you. She pushed off the wall. She straightened her spine. She walked back through the door. She walked back through that door knowing that the next 5 minutes were going to determine the shape of the rest of her life. The committee had rearranged themselves slightly in the 15-minute break. Small shifts the way people physically reorganize when a conversation has moved into new territory and their bodies are trying to reflect that. Tanaka had moved his notepad. Marsh had removed her reading glasses entirely and set them beside her water glass. The legal team had their pens down. Only Sterling sat exactly as he had before, in precisely the same posture, with the specific rigidity of a man who has decided that stillness is the only form of control left available to him. Priya Anand was still at the far end of the table. She looked at Cher when she came in and gave one single, barely perceptible nod, and Cher felt it land in her chest like hand on her shoulder. Whitfield sat. Cher sat. The room settled. Marsh looked at her hands for a moment before she spoke. Nurse Harper, the committee has reviewed the clinical evidence, the testimony provided, the relevant hospital protocols, and the additional material submitted during recess. She did not say Sawyer Pendleton's letter out loud, but everyone in the room understood. We are prepared to issue a preliminary finding. Cher's hands were flat on the table. She pressed them down until she could feel the grain of the wood through her palms. It is the finding of this committee, Marsh said, that the clinical presentation of the patient, Sawyer Pendleton, was consistent with tension pneumothorax. That the clinical indicators, specifically the absent left breath, sounds tracheal deviation, jugular venous distension, and the patient's rapid hemodynamic deterioration were present and observable prior to the initiation of the needle decompression procedure. She paused. It is further the finding of this committee that these indicators were communicated to the attending physician doctor, Richard Sterling, on 2 separate occasions by Nurse Harper, and that these communications were not acted upon. Another pause. Longer this time. It is the finding of this committee that Nurse Harper's intervention was clinically indicated medically correct and directly responsible for the preservation of the patient's life. The room was absolutely silent. Cher became aware that she was holding her breath. She let it go slowly through her nose without moving. With regard to the question of protocol violation, Marsh continued, and here her voice changed, not softer exactly, but more careful, the way a person's voice changes when they are navigating between 2 things that are both true. The committee acknowledges that Nurse Harper did act outside the strict technical boundaries of her scope of practice as defined by standard policy. However, the emergency exception protocol, as cited by Mr. Whitfield, provides adequate legal and institutional basis for the actions taken. Well, she folded her hands. The committee will not be pursuing disciplinary action against Nurse Harper. Her administrative leave is rescinded effective immediately. She is restored to full active status. Whitfield exhaled beside her. Not loudly, but she heard it. Furthermore, Tanaka said, taking the word from Marsh in the smooth, practiced handoff of people who have worked together for a long time, this committee recommends a full review of the diagnostic process in Bay 3 on the evening in question to be conducted by an independent clinical panel. That review will examine all decisions made by all clinical personnel during the relevant period. He was looking at Sterling when he said it, but his voice carried no particular weight, no extra gravity. He was simply a man stating a fact. Dr. Sterling, you will be placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of that review. Your clinical privileges are temporarily suspended. Sterling made no sound. His face had gone to a place beyond readable expression, somewhere distant, enclosed the face of a man who has traveled a very long distance very quickly and arrived somewhere he never imagined being. His representative put her hand on the table near his, not quite touching. He didn't look at Nento. This hearing is concluded, Marsh said. Thank you all. Chairs moved, people stood, papers were gathered. The room began to dissolve into motion, and Scher sat for a moment in the middle of it, not moving, just breathing, letting the reality of what had just happened finish arriving. Whitfield put his hand briefly on her shoulder. You okay? I don't know yet, she said honestly. That's okay, he said. You've got time to figure it out. He stood. I'll walk you out. As they moved toward the door, Priya Anand appeared beside Scher. She didn't say anything immediately. She just fell into step the way someone does when they have something to say, but need a moment to build the runway for it. They made it to the hallway. Whitfield dropped back to give them space. I should have spoken up in that bay, Priya said. I need you to know that I know that. You spoke up today, Scher said, in front of all of them. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Priya said simply. That's the thing. I absolutely did have to. She looked at Scher sideways, and for a moment her composed professional face gave way to something younger and more raw. I've been in this residency for 2 years, and I've spent most of it learning to be the right kind of quiet, to observe, to process, to not challenge above my level. And last night I watched you and I thought, she stopped. I thought she is going to get destroyed for this. And I also thought she is completely right. And I stood there, I did nothing. She shook her head. I'm not going to be that person. I decided that in the elevator on the way down last night, and I meant that. Scher stopped walking. She turned and looked at Priya fully. You saved your own career by staying quiet in that bay. I want you to understand that I know that, and I don't hold it against you. I know you don't, Priya said. That's almost the hardest part. They stood in that hallway for a moment, these two young women who had been in the same room when something enormous happened, and who were now standing on the other side of it, trying to figure out what it had made them. Buy you a terrible cafeteria coffee sometime, Scher said. Priya almost smiled. Yeah, she said, I'd like that. Then Scher turned the corner toward the elevator and walked directly into Dr. Richard Sterling. Neither of them had seen it coming. They both stopped. 3 feet between them, maybe 4. Close enough that Scher could see for the first time without the mediation of crisis or conference room formality what the last 14 hours had done to his face. He looked older, not dramatically, not the way they show it in movies, some sudden visual collapse. But there were lines around his eyes and mouth that she hadn't noticed in Bay 3, and the particular kind of fatigue sitting in them was not the fatigue of a long shift. It was deeper. It was the fatigue of a man who has had to reckon with something about himself that he had never previously been required to look at directly. She expected him to walk past her, or through her in the way he'd moved through space the night before, confident that the world would organize itself to accommodate his direction. He didn't. He stopped. He looked at her. And what was on his face in that unguarded hallway moment, stripped of the conference room and the committee and the audience, was not the arrogance she had braced herself for, and not the anger she had expected, and not the cold authority he had deployed like a scalpel in Bay 3. It was something she had not prepared for at all. I would have killed him, Sterling said. 3 words. Flat quiet, spoken in the voice of a man who has just finished saying something to himself for the 1,000th time and has decided finally to say it out loud to someone else. Scher didn't respond. She waited. I was certain, he said. I want you to understand I wasn't careless. I wasn't cutting corners. I was certain. In 31 years, that certainty has saved more lives than I can count. He stopped. His jaw worked. Last night it would have ended one. Yes, Cher said, quiet. Not unkind, just true. How did you see it? He asked. It was a genuine question. She understood that immediately, not rhetorical, not defensive, not laying groundwork for some argument she hadn't anticipated. A real question from a physician who needed to understand the answer. You had 4 minutes at the bedside. You had 31 years, she said. I think that might have been part of it. He looked at her. You've seen pulmonary embolism present that way 100 times, she said. Maybe more. So when the pattern started matching your brain, it was already there. It had already arrived before you finished looking. She paused. I didn't have patterns yet. I just had him. What was in front of me? She thought about Sawyer Pendleton's hand on her wrist, the grip of a man who knew. I looked at him because he was all I had. Sterling was quiet for a long moment. That's a terrible indictment of what experience can do to you, he said. Or it's just a thing that's true, Cher said. Both can be right. He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded, not deferentially, not dramatically, the nod of a man filing something important. He walked past her toward the elevator. She stood and watched him go, and thought about what it costs to be a person who has been certain for 31 years and then finds out in the loudest possible way that certainty has limits. She thought it must feel like the floor dropping away. She thought it must be one of the loneliest feelings in medicine. She did not feel sorry for him in a way that excused anything, but she felt something adjacent to sorrow, the way you feel it when you watch someone collide with a truth that cannot be unknown. Whitfield appeared at her elbow. Ready? Yes, she said. They rode the elevator down. They walked through the lobby, and as they pushed through the front doors into the afternoon air, Whitfield's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, held up one finger, answered. Cher stood on the steps and breathed the outside air and let the afternoon light sit on her face for a moment. Her own phone buzzed, a number she now had saved. Priya, check your hospital email. Tanaka just sent something to the department heads. Someone leaked it to the residents already. Read it. Cher opened her email. The subject line read, Clinical Culture Initiative, Immediate Implementation. She read it twice, then a third time. What Tanaka had written in the measured and deliberate language of a man who has been in institutional medicine long enough to know how to say enormous things quietly was essentially this: the events of the previous evening had made clear that St. Jude Memorial had a structural problem. Not a personnel problem, not an isolated incident, but a structural one. The kind that lives in the space between hierarchy and patient care, in the gap between authority and accuracy, in the silence that falls over a room when a junior staff member has something important to say and has learned through 1,000 small institutional lessons that the cost of saying it is too high. He was establishing a rapid response clinical consult protocol. Any staff member, regardless of rank, who held a substantive clinical concern about an active diagnosis could trigger a mandatory 60-second review by a second attending. Not optional. Not at the discretion of the treating physician. Mandatory. He was calling it the Harper Protocol. Cher read her own name in that email and felt something move through her that had no clinical name and that she couldn't have described to anyone standing near her. She stood on those steps and she read her name in that subject line, and she thought about 18-year-old Cher Harper, sitting in a nursing school orientation, listening to an instructor say that every patient who comes through that door is someone's person, and deciding right then and there that she was going to remember that always, no matter what, no matter how tired she was, no matter how intimidating the room, no matter who was telling her to be quiet. She had remembered the cost had been enormous, and now her name was on a protocol that would outlast her career, that would reach into rooms she would never see, that would give the next young nurse, the next Cher Harper, whoever they were, wherever they were, the institutional backing to say, I have a clinical concern, and have the weight of policy behind them when they said it. She sat down on the steps, just sat down right there because her legs were suddenly less reliable than they had been a moment ago. Whitfield finished his call. He came and stood beside her. He looked at her face and then at her phone. He read the email over her shoulder without being invited and without apology, the move of a man who has learned that moments like this don't wait for permission. Huh, he said. Yeah, she said. They named it after you. I see that. How do you feel? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it the way you think about things when you're too tired for anything except honesty. Scared, she said. Grateful. Like I want to call my mother, and also like I want to sleep for 3 days. She looked up at him. Is that normal? For someone who did what you did in the last 14 hours? He said. That's the most normal thing I've heard all day. Her phone rang. The number on the screen belonged to the ICU nursing station. She stared at it for a second. She answered, Nurse Harper. The voice was a nurse she didn't know, professional and kind. I have a patient asking to speak with you. He's been asking since this morning. His care team has cleared it if you are available. A brief pause. He says to tell you he's awake, and he remembers everything, and he wants to say it to your face. Cher closed her eyes for just a moment. Tell him I'm on my way, she said. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She looked at Whitfield. I need to go upstairs. Go, he said. I'll be in touch about the paperwork. She went back through the front doors and across the lobby and pressed the elevator button for the ICU floor. The elevator opened. She got in. She thought about what she was going to say to Sawyer Pendleton. She had been trained in therapeutic communication. She had studied it, practiced it, written papers about it. Appropriate emotional distance, professional boundaries, the clinical relationship and its necessary limits. She thought that none of that was going to be relevant in about 3 minutes. The elevator opened on the ICU floor and a nurse led her down the hall to a room at the end, and she pushed the door open and there he was. Sawyer Pendleton looked nothing like the man on the gurney. That man had been gray and gasping and enormous in his suffering. This man, still large, still silver-haired, still undeniably someone who occupied space with a certain natural authority, was propped up against pillows with a chest tube and an IV in the specific, slightly battered quality of someone who has been through something serious and survived it and is still taking stock of what that means. His eyes were blue, completely blue and completely sharp. He looked at her for a moment and she could see him processing matching the face in front of him to the memory of the hands and the needle, and the voice saying, I know in the dark of Bay 3. There she is, he said. His voice was rough from the oxygen and the chest tube, but warm underneath, fundamentally warm in the way some people's voices just are. The woman who won an argument with my chest. Cher surprised herself completely by laughing. A real laugh, short and sudden and real, the kind you can't perform and can't suppress. That's one way to describe it, she said. Come in, he said. Please, sit down. You look like you've been awake for a week. 14 hours, she said, pulling the chair to his bedside. Roughly. In this building. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the bay, that observant, complete attention that his wife had described, and that Cher could now recognize as simply the way Sawyer Pendleton looked at things that mattered to him. Like he was deciding to know them. Like looking was already a form of commitment. My wife told me about the committee, he said. She was very persuasive, Cher said. She always has been, he said. 40% of what I've accomplished in my life is Margaret being persuasive on my behalf and me being smart enough to stay out of her way. He paused, his hands shifted on the bed. I know what it cost you last night, standing there with that needle. I know what it cost you. You're breathing, she said. That's the accounting that matters. No, he said, and his voice was very gentle and very firm at the same time. Don't do that. Don't minimize it. I've spent 30 years working with people who do difficult things, and I know what it looks like from the inside, and I know what people do with it when they are trying to be gracious. He looked at her. You were terrified. She held his gaze. Yes, she said. I was. And you did it anyway. You grabbed my wrist, she said, in the bay, when they first brought you in. She looked at his hand on the bed. You couldn't speak, but you grabbed my wrist, and you looked at me, and I knew. I think that's the moment I knew for certain I wasn't wrong. He was quiet for a moment. I remember that, he said. I remember it exactly. I thought this one sees it. He shook his head slowly. I've hired a lot of people over the years. I know what it looks like when someone sees clearly. You see clearly, Cher Harper. She sat with that for a moment. Mr. Pendleton, she said, I need to tell you something. Sawyer, he said, please. Sawyer, she leaned forward slightly. Dr. Sterling, the doctor who had the wrong diagnosis. He spoke to me this afternoon in the hallway. And I think he's going to be okay. Not braided away, but I think he's going to find his way to something real on the other side of this. She wasn't sure why she was saying it, maybe because Sawyer Pendleton felt like someone who carried responsibility for the effects of things, and she wanted him to know the whole picture. I didn't want you to think of him as a villain. It's more complicated than that. Sawyer looked at her for a long moment. My wife said you were something, he said. She was underselling it. She started to respond, and his hand moved, not grabbing this time, but resting gently on her forearm. The same hand, the same warmth. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. I'm not asking right now for an answer. I'm just asking you to think about it. He paused. I've been funding healthcare initiatives for 20 years, and most of them have been built by people with excellent credentials and very little courage. I'm interested in changing that ratio. His eyes were steady on hers. Would you be willing to sit down with Margaret when I'm out of this bed and talk about what that could look like? A training program. Something real, something built by someone who has actually stood in that room and made that choice. Cher opened her mouth. Think about it, he said again gently. Don't answer yet. She nodded. She sat with it. She felt the weight of it, not a burden, but the real specific gravity of something that matters the way a tool feels in your hand when it was made for the right purpose. She looked at his monitor. Steady, strong, oxygen saturation 98%. Outside the window, the afternoon was moving toward evening. The rain had stopped. The city was doing what cities do, continuing carrying on, being indifferent to the specific enormity of individual moments, while those moments happened inside it anyway. Sawyer Pendleton was alive. Cher Harper had her badge back. And somewhere in this building, something had shifted, not just for her, not just for him, but in the slow, institutional way that real change moves when it finally starts to move quietly from the inside out, one room at a time. She sat at his bedside a little longer. She didn't answer yet, but she already knew what she was going to say. She said yes 3 days later, not in the hospital, not in a conference room with legal ads and institutional lighting. She said it at a corner table in a small coffee shop 2 blocks from St. Jude, across from Margaret Pendleton, who had arrived 7 minutes early and was already drinking tea and reading something on her phone with the efficient calm of a woman who does not waste a minute she doesn't have to waste. Sawyer was still in the ICU one more day, his physician said, then a step-down unit. Then home, but Margaret had come alone, which Cher understood immediately was intentional. This first conversation was between the two of them. Woman to woman. No husbands, no titles, no institutional weight pressing down on the air. Margaret looked up when Cher sat down. She studied her face the way she'd studied her in the conference room directly without apology, the look of someone who has learned to read people quickly because her life has required it. You've slept, Margaret said. Some, Cher said. Enough. Good. Margaret set her phone face down. Then let's talk. What they talked about for the next 90 minutes was on the surface logistics. A training initiative, a curriculum, funding structures, institutional partnerships, the long practical architecture of turning a single act of courage into something that could teach courage to other people, which is, as they both acknowledged, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, a nearly impossible thing to do, and also the only thing worth trying. But underneath the logistics, what they were actually talking about was this: what does it mean to be the person in the room who sees clearly? What does it cost? And how do you build a system that doesn't punish that person for what they see? The problem, Cher said, isn't that people don't see. Most of the time in my experience, and I know my experience is 8 months long, so take that for what it's worth. Your experience is longer than 8 months, Margaret said. Your experience is every patient you've sat with and every instinct you've trained. Don't discount it. Cher looked at her. Most of the time, she continued, people see. They see the thing that's wrong. They feel it. But they've been taught in 100 different ways that the cost of saying it out loud is higher than the cost of staying quiet. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. That's what needs to change. Not people's ability to see. Their belief that being seen, seeing it, is survivable. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That she said is exactly the sentence I needed to hear, to know that Sawyer's instinct about you was right. She picked up her tea. So, will you lead it? Cher had been expecting the question since she sat down. She had run it through her head from every angle for 3 days, every practical objection, every reason to say not yet, or not me, or maybe someone more qualified. She had a list of those reasons. It was a long list. She had looked at it carefully, and then she had set it down. Yes, she said. Margaret nodded once. No celebration, no effusion. Just a nod that said the right answer has arrived, and now we have work to do. Cher found she liked that. She found she liked Margaret Pendleton very much. One condition, Cher said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Priya Anand is involved. Dr. Anand. She's a second-year resident in the ER, and she has things to say about this that matter. She should have a voice in building it. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, but something that recognized and approved. Done, she said. Anyone else? Cher thought of Donna Reyes. Donna, who had put a stethoscope on Sawyer Pendleton's chest and heard nothing, and said so, who had looked at Cher across that gurney and given her the nod that said, I'm with you, who had sent 3 words in a text message at midnight and meant every one of them. One more, she said. She went back to work on Thursday. She had expected it to feel different returning to the ER after everything, walking back through the ambulance bay doors with her badge active and her name on a protocol, in the particular strange weight of being known suddenly in a building where she had been largely invisible for 8 months. She had expected stares, or distance, or the careful professional courtesy that is its own form of distance. What she got instead was Donna Reyes, who was at the nurse's station doing chart work, when Cher walked in, and who looked up and who said without any preamble whatsoever, "You're late." "My shift starts in 4 minutes, Cher said. "I know," Donna said. "I was making a point." But her eyes were warm, fundamentally completely warm. The ER wrapped itself around Cher the way it always had, loud and purposeful and relentless. Monitors beeped. Gurneys moved. Voices overlapped. The particular fluorescent-lit urgency of a place that never stops moving gathered her in, and she felt herself breathe into it the way you breathe into something that fits. She was in Bay 2 with a 53-year-old presenting with acute abdominal pain when the first real test of the new protocol happened. Not a test of the Harper protocol specifically, but a test of who she was now on the other side of everything. The attending on duty was Dr. Marcus Webb, a 10-year veteran who was not Dr. Sterling and who did not have Dr. Sterling's particular brand of certainty, but who had his own patterns, his own well-worn diagnostic grooves. He had looked at the patient, a woman named Carla, who kept telling everyone she was fine and that her husband had overreacted by calling 911, which Cher recognized immediately as the specific denial of someone who is more frightened than she wants to admit, and said, "Gallstones, let's get an ultrasound ordered and get her comfortable." And Cher had looked at Carla's face, at the location of the pain when she pressed carefully at the patient's blood pressure, at the specific quality of her discomfort. She'd felt it, that quiet, certain gathering of something in her chest that meant her eyes were telling her something her voice now had to say out loud. "Dr. Webb," she said, "can I flag a clinical concern?" Those were the exact words from Tanaka's protocol. Flag a clinical concern. 5 words that now, by institutional mandate, required a mandatory 60-second review. Webb looked up from the chart. He was 42, dark-haired, with the specific expression of someone encountering something new and trying to calibrate their response to it in real time. He knew what those words meant now. Everyone in the department knew what those words meant. "Go ahead," he said. "Her pain is epigastric, not right upper quadrant. It's radiating to her back. Her BP is 150/92, which she's telling me is not normal for her. She's diaphoretic, and she says she ate a large meal 2 hours ago." Cher kept her voice level, factual, not challenging, presenting. "I want to rule out acute pancreatitis before we go toward gallstones." Webb was quiet for 3 seconds. He looked at Carla. He pressed 2 fingers to the epigastric region, the way Cher had described, and Carla made a sound that was involuntary and sharp. "Get me a lipase," Webb said, "and amylase. Hold the ultrasound pending." The lipase came back at 408, and Carla had acute pancreatitis. She was admitted within the hour. Webb found Cher at the nurse's station afterward. He stood beside her for a moment looking at the board and said without making it a big thing, "Good catch." "Thank you for listening," she said. He looked at her sideways. "That protocol," he said. "I'll be honest, when Tanaka announced it, my first reaction was to think it was going to be chaos. Every nurse second-guessing every physician, nothing moving, everyone covering themselves instead of treating patients." He paused. "That's not what just happened." "No," Cher said. "What just happened was faster," he said, "and cleaner." He picked up a chart. "Huh," he said the same way Whitfield had said it when he read Tanaka's email and walked away. Cher stood at the nurse's station and allowed herself privately and briefly to feel something very close to joy. Then her pager went off and she went back to work. What she didn't know yet, what she would only find out 2 weeks later in the way you find things out when the storm has passed and the information that was moving underground during it starts to surface, was what had happened to Dr. Richard Sterling in the days after the committee hearing. She found out from Priya, who found out from a resident who had been in the room who had heard it directly. Sterling had requested a meeting with the Tanaka, not with legal representation, not with his own advocate, alone. He had walked into Tanaka's office and he had sat down and he had said, according to the account Cher received third hand and believed completely because it had the specific texture of something true, "I need to tell you what I think actually happened." And what he had said was this. He had said that in the days since Bay 3, he had done something he had not done in a very long time, which was to sit with a case and take it apart piece by piece without defending himself to himself while he did it. He had looked at every indicator Cher had cited. He had gone back through the literature on tension pneumothorax, not because he didn't know it, but because he wanted to see it with fresh eyes. The way you reread a book after a life event has changed what you're capable of understanding. And what he had found was that he had not missed the signs because they were subtle. He had missed them because he had stopped looking for them the moment his pattern recognition fired. I diagnosed him before I finished examining him, Sterling had said to Tanaka. I knew I was right, and I knew it before I had enough information to know anything. And then every subsequent piece of data I encountered, I filtered through the diagnosis I had already made. He had paused. That is not an error of knowledge. That is an error of arrogance. And I need to say that out loud to someone before I decide what comes next. Tanaka had listened. He had not absolved, and he had not condemned. He had said, what do you want to do with that? Sterling had said he wanted to teach. Not treat, not yet, maybe not ever again. In an ER setting, he wasn't sure that was a conversation for another day. But he wanted to teach physicians about diagnostic anchoring, about what happens when certainty calcifies, about the version of experience that becomes its own blindness. He wanted to teach it because he had just learned it in the most humbling way a person can learn anything by being wrong, when it mattered most in front of a room full of people, in a moment that had been witnessed and recorded and named. He could have walked away, Priya said when she told Sher. They were in the cafeteria 2 weeks after everything bad coffee in front of both of them, exactly as promised. He had enough retirement to disappear quietly. Nobody would have chased him. He could have been the guy the institution let slide because the alternative was too messy. Why didn't he? Cher asked, although she thought she already knew. Priya wrapped both hands around her cup. He said, and this is the part that got me, he said that you told him in the hallway that looking at Pendleton was all you had, that because you had no patterns yet, you just looked at the actual person in front of you. She paused. He said he's been practicing medicine for 31 years and he can't remember the last time he just looked at the actual person. She looked at Cher. He said he wants to remember how to do that before he's done. Cher sat with that for a long time. She thought about a hallway and a man who looked like he had traveled very far, very fast. She thought about what it costs to be wrong in a way that is indelible and how the people who survive that cost with any integrity intact are rarer than they should be, and how she had not expected Richard Sterling to be one of them, and how being wrong about that felt like a specific and worthwhile kind of relief. Is he going to be okay? She asked. I think so, Priya said. I think it's going to take a long time, and I think it's going to be hard, and I think he's going to earn every bit of it. She looked at Cher. Which is as it should be. Yes, Cher said. That's exactly as it should be. 6 weeks after Bay 3, the Pendleton Collaborative Care Initiative held its first session in a conference room on the 3rd floor of St. Jude Memorial Hospital. 16 people attended, nurses, residents, 2 attendings, a pharmacist, and a patient advocate. Cher stood at the front of the room with notes she had written and rewritten 4 times, and she looked at the faces looking back at her, and she thought about 18-year-old Cher Harper in a nursing school orientation, and about Sawyer Pendleton's wrist in the dark, and about the sound of a pressure valve releasing. She put her notes down. I'm going to tell you what actually happened, she said. Not the version that went in the report. The real version, what I felt, what I almost didn't do, what it cost to do it anyway. She looked around the room, because that's the thing nobody teaches you. They teach you the clinical skill. They don't teach you what it feels like to use it when every person in the room with more experience than you is moving in the opposite direction. She paused. That's what we are going to talk about today. Not theory, what it actually feels like, and what you do with that feeling. The room was completely quiet. Who has been in a situation, she said, where you saw something and you didn't say it, not because you were wrong, because you were afraid? She looked around the room, and you can be honest because I'm going to raise my hand too. 15 hands went up, including Priya's, including one of the attendings, a woman named Dr. Sarah Cho, who was 10 years into her career and who raised her hand with the careful deliberateness of someone deciding that this room is safe enough for the truth. Cher raised her own hand, last. She kept it up. Good, she said. That's where we start. What happened in that room over the next 2 hours, the conversations that opened, the things that were said, the specific and irreplaceable quality of a group of medical professionals talking honestly about fear, instead of pretending it doesn't exist in medicine, was something that none of the 16 people present would fully be able to describe to someone who wasn't there. But every one of them would carry it forward, into their next shift, into the next room where they felt something and had to decide whether to say it, into the next moment when the person with the most authority said that's impossible, and they had to decide whether to trust what their own eyes were telling them. Sawyer Pendleton was discharged from St. Jude Memorial on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after he had been brought through the ambulance bay doors on a gurney. He walked out on his own feet, which he had insisted upon waving off the standard wheelchair protocol, with the cheerful stubbornness of a man who has recently been reminded that the ability to walk is not something to be taken for granted. Margaret was beside him. She had been beside him in various forms for the better part of a week. Sher was not on duty that Thursday. She didn't know he was being discharged until she got a text from Donna Reyes that said simply, "He asked for you. He said to tell you the count is 98% and he intends to keep it there." She laughed. She was standing in her kitchen in her own clothes in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, and she laughed the way she had laughed in his ICU room. Short, sudden, completely real. She texted back, "Tell him I'm going to hold him to that." That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had sat in the rain-dark early morning, and waited to find out what her life was going to look like. The rain was gone now. The evening was clear, and the city was doing its city thing outside her window, continuing its enormous, indifferent life, while she sat inside hers and took quiet stock of everything that had changed. 8 months ago, she had been a rookie with a new badge and a granola bar in her pocket, and the straightforward, uncomplicated intention of being a good nurse. She had not been planning to defy anyone. She had not been planning to make history. She had been planning to show up and pay attention and do her job as well as she possibly could. That was still true. None of that had changed. What had changed was this: she knew now with the bone-deep certainty that only comes from having been tested that paying attention was not a passive act. That seeing clearly and saying what you see in rooms that do not want to hear it in front of people who have decided already, in moments when the cost is real and the outcome is not guaranteed, that was not insubordination. That was the whole job. That was what medicine was supposed to be, not the hierarchy, not the protocol, not the armor of certainty built over 30 years of pattern recognition. It was this: a human being looking at another human being and saying, "I see you. I see what's happening, and I will not look away." Cher Harper was 23 years old. She had been a nurse for 8 months and 3 weeks. She had one protocol with her name on it, one initiative in its first 6 weeks of life, one patient whose oxygen saturation was 98% because she had picked up a needle when every voice in that room, including the loudest voice in her own head, told her to put it down. She was going to be a very good nurse. She already was.